Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to IPC for this week, and we are focusing totally on mummification this week. At the beginning of the week, I will be talking to you about the process, how it worked, why the ancient Egyptians did it, and the order in which they did things. And then later on in the week, Miss Flukes gets to do the fun part where she'll be teaching you how to mummify a tomato. Okay, so let's start today just looking at our learning intention. And we are trying to be able to explain how the ancient Egyptians mummified their dead. And part of the success criteria will be to order the steps in the mummification process, because if you got it in the wrong order, things wouldn't go well. Okay, first of all, what is a mummy? Okay, now in terms of ancient Egypt, a mummy is a body that has been preserved after death. Sorry. It could be a human or an animal, because the Egyptians quite like to mummify their pets as well, usually the cat. Okay, so mummy is a way of keeping a body well preserved after someone has died. The big question is why? Why did the Egyptians preserve their bodies? Well, the Egyptians believed that when they died, the soul left their bodies, okay? And when they were buried, their soul would return. And together the body would live forever in the afterlife. Now, what the Egyptians firmly believed, that unless the body was preserved, it would be no good in the afterlife, because the soul has to be able to recognize the body. And if it couldn't recognize the body, then they would be left to eternally wander the earth. Okay, they wouldn't be able to go to the afterlife. They'd be caught in between the worlds. The question on the screen there says, did all Egyptians preserve bodies? Well, not everyone could afford to. It was a really expensive process, cost loads of money, and about 70 days to do it properly. So usually it was something that the very rich Egyptians did, okay, like nobles, lords, and of course the pharaoh. So it says here, how did mummification start? Who came up with the idea? Well, first of all, the ancient Egyptians used to just bury their dead in pits in the desert. But the problem they would have was that the animals would be digging them up. Okay, they would get half eaten, and that's not very good if you were trying to go to the afterlife, because they believed that your body needed to be intact, it needed to be whole. Okay, so the Egyptians developed the idea of mummifying. And that's what the ancient Egyptians are famous for today. You know, I'm sure in our heads, if you talk about the word Egyptian mummies, you'd be thinking about monsters in cartoons like Scooby-Doo and films, and they'd have like people walking, the bodies will be walking with bandages wrapped around them. Well, mummification was actually not quite as scary or as exciting as that. But what we're going to do now is start thinking about the process. How did it happen? So when somebody died, if they were rich enough, they got taken to something called the beautiful house. Okay, now the beautiful house was not that beautiful, not really. And what happened inside there, the body was, it says, cleansed with palm wine. So basically it would have all the dirt and the grime cleaned off it using palm wine, and then they would be rinsed with water from the River Nile. And then quite often in the beautiful house, what would happen is the body would be laid on a slatted bed. Now, a slatted bed, if you imagine lots of you that have slat beds at home, if you take the mattress off, they've got planks of wood going across with holes in the middle. And that kind of was a little bit like the slatted bed that the bodies were put on. And the idea was that then any fluids, any bodily fluids, as the body started to dry out, would then drop down through the slats and then would run away in a like a gully or a drain. So actually it was a clever way of trying to stop the body from the moisture staying in the body. We're now coming to the bit where it gets a bit gory. Okay, once that had been done, once the body had been left for a period of time to have all the sort of bodily fluids run away, they then decided it was time at that point to remove the organs. Okay, now when we're talking about organs, we're talking about the lungs, the liver, the sort of stomach and intestines, and the that's about it actually. So what they didn't do was remove the brain, and they didn't remove the heart at this point. The heart had to be kept in the body. Okay, they believed it was, that was the Egyptians believed that that was the bit that the intelligence came from, not the brain. They believed that the heart was crucial, okay, and it was needed in the body in the afterlife. So they would leave the heart inside the body. The rest would be removed. And what they used to do, they make a slit in the left-hand side of the body, and then they would remove the organs. Now, those organs would then be dried out. So they would be dried out, and then they would be put into what we call canopic jars, and we'll have a look at some of these in a moment. So they used to use, what they used was something to dry the organs out and to dry the body out in the end as well. They used something called natron. Now, natron was a type of salt, and it helped the body to dry out. It removed the moisture from the body. It started to make sure that the body then was going to be able to be preserved. Any moisture that stayed in the body would help the body to decompose. And if it decomposed, it would end up falling apart. So they would remove the organs, the lungs, the liver, the stomach, and the intestines, and they would be put into a special jar called a canopic jar. Now, we can see canopic jars in Egypt today. They've dug up quite a few of them over the years, and they're all in the main museums in Cairo. And all of the canopic jars had lids that were heads of the gods. So we talked about gods last week having animal heads, a lot of them, and you can see these here they have animal heads on them. Okay, so this is where, when the mummies were buried, eventually in their tombs, the canopic jars will be buried with them. Now, the brain, this is the bit that I hinted to my children last week when I was doing catch-up meetings. We talked about the brain and how the ancient Egyptians would remove the brain. Now, the reason they didn't worry about the brain so much was they didn't think it was very important. They thought the brain didn't do very much. It was the heart that was really, really important to the ancient Egyptians. So, and this is the bit that gets a bit gory, they still had to remove the brain. Otherwise, it would help, the body would start to decompose, as we talked about just now. So they didn't want the body to rot, they didn't want the head to rot, so they would pull the brain out. And what they did, they stuck a long hook up through the nose, and they kept going. So if you imagine don't really want you to do this, but if you were to stick your finger up your nose, you can reach the top of your nose and you can't go any further. The ancient Egyptians, what they did was stick a hook up, and they kept knocking it in so that it went right up through and into their brain. And what they did then, they used the hook to smash the brain into pieces, smaller pieces, and then they used the hook to pull the brain out through the nose. So if you imagine, the hook used to grab hold of the brain and pull it down, so there was nothing left inside the skull. The brain was all removed through the nose. Okay, now I talked briefly about natron just now. The reason that the ancient Egyptians used natron, or natural salt, was that 75% of our bodies are water, okay? And wet things rot very quickly, okay? Whether it's a body, whether it's wood, anything that gets wet, if we're not careful, can rot. So what they needed to do was get the body to dry on the outside and the inside with natron. So what they did with the body, after they'd removed all the organs, apart from the heart, of course, they would place the body into a container, and they would, the slits in the side and up the nose, from where they pulled the brain out, they would stuff all of that full of natron or salt, so that it helped to dry out the inside of the body. And then they would cover the body with natron, the salt. And then what this would happen is the natron then would absorb the moisture. It would suck the moisture out of the body. But this could take up to 40 or 50 days to do. And when it was done, when it was finished, you were left with a very dry body. Okay, all the moisture was gone. Once the natron drying out process was complete, the organs could be either put back into the body, because they were dried out by then, or they would be placed in the canopic jars, like we said. If the body if the organs weren't put back in the body, then what they did was stuff the body, the cavities that where the organs had come from, the holes, the spaces, they would stuff them with anything they could get their hands on, whether it was sawdust, sand, leaves, anything that helped the body to keep its shape. Otherwise, it would start to collapse. The skin, because obviously skin is a living organism as well, is if it's dried out, it will start to crack. So what they did then, they preserved the skin by painting it with a type of resin that would help it to keep preserved, almost like a paint. It was almost painted. And the body then was what we did, how we recognise mummies from today. The body then was now wrapped in strips of linen. Now it says on the screen here, there were hundreds of meters of this, lots of layers. Usually, if they were very wealthy, because it was quite expensive to do this, they would be wrapped in these linen bandages up to 20 layers thick. And it was quite, it says quite an elaborate process. It was quite a difficult process. After every layer, usually an amulet or a good luck charm would be placed on top of the wrapping before the next layer would go on. This was supposed to protect the dead person and bring them luck in the afterlife. Now, lots of you were talking to me about Anubis on our chat the other day. While the wrapping was taking place, a priest or a religious man wearing a mask of Anubis, so looking like the jackal, would read out spells to ward off evil spirits and help the journey to the afterlife. The reason it was Anubis was that he was the god of the dead. Now, this is something that is very interesting. It's something I didn't know till I started teaching about ancient Egypt. The word mummy comes from it's a tar-like paste that was used, called mamaya, and it was used like glue. It was like a type of glue to glue all the strips of linen down and glue them together. This meant that they couldn't come unwrapped, they couldn't fall off, and that's where the word mummy comes from. That tar-like paste, a black paste called mamaya. And then finally, once all the strips were stuck down and had been wrapped around the body, a final piece of cloth, what we call the shroud, was placed over the body. The mummification process is now complete. The only thing that was left was that the Egyptians had to place the bodies into like a coffin case, a mummy case. Now, the first thing they did was put a death mask on. Now, the death mask had to look like the body that was inside the linen. The idea was that then the soul would be able to find its body in the afterlife. If it never had a death mask on, it was just the mummy, then the soul probably wouldn't be able to recognize its own body. So that's really important to the ancient Egyptians. The first thing the Egyptians did then with their mummy was put them into a wooden coffin. The wooden coffin wasn't always very elaborate, but gradually they would be put into a slightly bigger coffin, then another bigger coffin, then another bigger coffin. So actually they would have probably 3 or 4 different layers, and they would become gradually more decorated. Lots of gold paint, lots of blue. You'd usually have, if it was a pharaoh, he'd be holding usually the signs of being a pharaoh. The sort of the you can see him on the screen there. He's got his arms crossed. He's holding what the pharaoh used to hold when he was in court. And usually there would be hieroglyphics all around the coffin as well. Finally, the outer coffin case, the outer mummy case, was placed into what we call a sarcophagus, a big chamber. Usually, if it was a pharaoh, so Tutankhamun's was made out of gold, and it's in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo today. Quite an amazing thing. Tutankhamun's had doors rather than a lid, so that the mummy cases or his treasure could be put in with him, and the mummy case could easily be slid in. Usually food, drink, and valuable, as we said, his treasure, valuable objects, would go in with him, in with the mummy, so that he had things that he could use on his way to the afterlife. Now, we've talked about the process. Okay, you've listened to me for quite a while. Now it's your turn. The independent task today, Indiana Jones, the famous archaeologist, has dropped his folder. The mummification steps have been jumbled up. Can you help Dr. Jones to reorder them correctly? Okay, so your job then will be to look at the resource file today. Now I've attached it to the lesson folder on the school website. So you can, if you wanted to, you could print it. If you're in school, you'll be able to look at a paper copy of it. If you're at home, you'll be able to just pull it up on the screen if you need to. Now the step, basically on the resource file, there are steps, the mummification steps, but they're all mixed up now. Indiana Jones has dropped them. They've gone all over the place. Your job is to put them in the right order. Now, once you've put them in the right order, once you've worked out what the order is, I want you to write a set of instructions on how to mummify a body. So I want you to look at the success criteria on the next page in order to help you. Actually, in all fairness, I've kind of got them in the wrong order. This is a copy here of the steps. Okay, this is what is on the website. This is what you can be looking at, but they are all in the wrong order. Okay, you've got to put them in the right order before you start. Maybe number them. Maybe if you have got a paper copy, you can cut them up and put them in the right order. It's very important you get them in the right order, otherwise you will not get yourself a proper Egyptian mummy. Now, I talked just now about success criteria. For this criteria of writing the set of instructions, I want you to make sure that you've got the steps in the right order. Use this video if you need help. You can always rewind it. You can always look at it again. I want you to order the process using numbered steps. So I want you to give me a step-by-step guide. So number 1, what's step 1? 2, what's step 2? And then I want you to begin each step with an imperative verb, a verb that orders you to do something. So for example, remove the brain by ramming a hook up the nose into the brain and pulling. Okay, so you can see that I've put the verb at the beginning. I don't want to see firstly, secondly, thirdly. You don't need that because you've got numbered steps. You start it with an imperative verb, please, telling me what you want me to do on each step. And you can, if you want to make a really good job of this, add a picture or a diagram to each step if you want to. I hope this has all made sense. You've been listening to me for a little while now. I want you now to go ahead and do it, okay? You've got two afternoons to do this and to make a really good job of it. Take care, guys, and I'll see you next week for the final week of Ancient Egypt. Okay, take care then. Bye-bye.